chamando os convidados para compor o painel 1, experiências internacionais e nacionais com instrumentos inovadores e investimentos de impacto. Como moderador, o Sr. Marco Aurélio Croco, vice-presidente da BDE e do BDMG. Para tratar sobre o tema Desenvolvimento de Instrumentos Financeiros Inovadores Verdes, convidamos os senhores Tom Heller, membro do Conselho Não Executivo e consultor estratégico sênior. Sr. Tom Heller. E Barbara Bushner, diretora executiva do programa Climate Policy Initiative, ambos da Climate Finance. Sobre o tema Situação e Oportunidades do Mercado de Títulos Verdes no Mundo, Região e Brasil, convidamos a senhora Justine Leibel, diretora de Desenvolvimento de Mercado no Climate Bonds Initiative. Com a palavra, o moderador.
Bom dia a todos. Eu vou moderar e vou dar o adiantado da hora. Eu vou restringir o moderador ao máximo as palavras dele. Então eu vou imediatamente dar início à sessão e vamos começar aqui com o Tom Heller, na temática de desenvolvimento de instrumentos financeiros inovadores verdes. 20 minutos para cada um. Tá? Tom, please. You're welcome.
Bom dia. Agradeço o convite à BDE para invitar-me cá, mas para evitar mi portunhol tão feio, vou falar em inglês, espero que todos possam mais ou menos compreender. It's very nice to be here. I know the topic of the event today are innovation finance, innovative finance, and green bonds, títulos verdes. And I think my role in particular, I've been asked to speak about the international, the global, and the developmental, the future side of green finance. And I'm going to leave particular investigation of innovative finance to my colleague Barbara, who is deeply involved both with Beach and with the development of instruments here in Brazil, and focus myself on the more general scale, more general phenomena in the global markets. And I would like to make the point that, of course, green finance, sustainable finance, sustainable infrastructure, whatever we want to use as the term to describe this phenomenon, will be responsive to particular policy, whether it's climate policy or sustainability policy. But we have to remember it's finance, not just green finance. So what is going to drive it over the next decades is essentially what is going on in the world of economics, particularly macroeconomics, and finance, and political institutions, how we organize our regulatory systems, and a series of more general phenomena that became clear to me when I was asked several weeks ago by a Chinese newspaper if I were looking back for 2050, what do I think would have been the primary factors in determining whether we had avoided the worst aspects of environmental risk, or what is increasingly called sustainability shocks? And my answer surprised me. Basically what I said was, I think there are three things that will determine what it is how we look at our achievement. The first is the macroeconomic situation, which determines, of course, both our thinking about economics and finance. Secondly, it's what happens in Asia, because the geopolitical changes in the world that we are all experiencing, certainly people in my country are experiencing in a very profound way at the present time, but also because Asia basically continues to grow and bases its energy demand at this point largely on coal. So there is no question that what happens in Asia, both geopolitically and in terms of its specific development policies, will drive the global situation. And finally, and perhaps this is because I come from Silicon Valley, I've been a professor at Stanford most of my life, I said digital infrastructure. In other words, what we see in the world of technological change that will increase our capacity to grow the economy and at the same time to do so in a way that is much less resource intensive, because that's what change comes from. Using up large numbers of resources in order to provide infrastructure services. So let me step back from 50 years to where we are, which is 25 years after Rio, more or less halfway. That is the first Rio conference. And look around and say, what do I see now? And basically, I would like to organize this talk and another talk that I will give at Bandass at the end of the month, also with Beach, on August 31st, I think it is, to say that I see four things that are the trends going on in the world that will determine the shape and the volumes of green finance. The first, in which I think we have been living for some time now, and which is going pretty well, I would call the change from micro to macro. And I will explain that in a second. It's from micro particular projects to large-scale financing. Second, I would talk about the change from public to private. And I think that's part of what is going on here today with the lab initiative, in the sense that infrastructure is moving from being publicly produced to being produced in various hybrid forms. And we see that in the financial world with the addition of private finance and different ways of approaching this problem than we started with. The third major change that is happening, I would call a change from projects to systems. It's not a question any longer of only are we building a renewable plant or working on a particular industrial efficiency technique. It is the way we produce these critical goods as systems that will dominate the next period, that will open up investment opportunities, change the nature of financial risk, and be a key to whether or not we actually make this passage. And the last thing I would say is we have to change from perceiving climate and other sustainability issues strictly as environmental issues. They must become the substance of economic growth, because that is where we find ourselves in the world in general. And I will try to say more about that, probably particularly in my talk at Bandass at the end of the month, but I'll try and make some introductory remarks on now. And the main point that I would like you to take away from whatever I have to contribute to this conversation is that the world in 1992, at the first Rio conference, when we really began to shape the institutions that affect climate change and other sustainability projects, is a different world than we live in today. It is different in terms of the macroeconomics. It is different in terms of finance. We've been through a major crisis. It is different in terms of the way people think of themselves, their identity. My children, my grandchildren, think of themselves through which networks they're on the machine. on this thing. They don't think of themselves as geographically limited. There are whole new forms of identity that are emerging. All of these things together must be taken into account, because if we try and solve sustainability problems in terms of the way we thought about them in 1992, which is already different from the way we should be thinking about them in 2017, but I promise you will be totally different than the world in 2042. If we solve the former problems, we will not have solved the problems as they will be when the issues of looking back from that period really take hold. So my basic argument is, where are we in the middle of this passage? Where do we expect that we will be when this is finished, and how do we act in those terms? Let me just ask my moderator, because I didn't know when I started. I'm sorry? 10 minutes left. Okay. Let me be quick. Where have we gotten so far, and where are the problems we are looking at today? We started out in the world of climate, but other sustainability issues as well, in 1992 by asking two questions. How much more does it cost to do things, let me just say, clean or green, whatever you want to call it, than the way we've been doing? And we spent a lot of time, I spent a lot of my time doing cost curves. How much more does it cost? And we tried to figure out not only how much more did it cost, but who was going to pay for it? And these became the critical questions of the international negotiations and of national policy. What we have experienced are sharply falling costs in some fields. The spreads between green and brown have diminished, especially in renewable energy. Not so clear in energy efficiency, not so clear in land use and agriculture yet, although I think that is going to be a phenomenon we'll see in other sectors. But if you are in a world of high growth, and if you have declining costs, and if you have available and plentiful capital markets, all of which were true in 1992, you think about solving the problem by adding new vintages of infrastructure, new forms of production. You are turning over your infrastructure fairly quickly in a high growth, high capital world where there is technological change. And so, I think we get the results of Paris, which were positive, in which governments affirmed that they, in these cases of falling cost differentials, they would make pledges that they would be able to carry out that were reasonably ambitious. Not perfect, talk about that in just a second, but not bad. And as long as the costs, total costs, were falling, then the principal situation, the problem switched from the economics of added costs to finance. Because most of the new technologies where costs were falling were highly capital intensive. In other words, you pay for renewable energy at the start. You don't pay for it in a combination of capital costs at the beginning and variable and fuel costs later on. Now in Brazil with hydro, you've always been in a somewhat different situation than other countries, although the marginal capital that is coming into the energy sector remains fossil fuel dependent. What are the results of this? Countries have done well moving toward their goals. In other words, if we look at China, if we look at India, if we look at Brazil principally in the land use area, if we look at Mexico in energy, people have treated these goals as being in good faith, and they have developed a whole portfolio of public mechanisms that are being used to approach this, whether they are taxes, like carbon taxes or prices, whether they are feed-in tariffs or other forms of subsidies, whether they are direct investment as a national bank or multilateral banks offering capital, nearly always at below full market rates into these sectors. Whether it could be through guarantees rather than various forms of direct capital investment, or whether it's through regulation. which may have been the most productive in terms of targets. You must have 33%, next 50% in California of renewable energy, which creates different markets for renewable energy and fossil with different prices. So a large number of innovative, different forms of political capital flowing in, public capital, public finance flowing into this sector in ways that are extremely productive. What are the problems at which we are looking? Some of it is being answered by trying to align and structure private capital. Blended finance, various forms of innovative finance that are trying to make sure that this public capital is used efficiently. But secondly, we know that the scale is inadequate. I have with me a volume, I don't know, Maria can tell me whether it's been done, on supporting national development banks. That was done between IBD and my colleague Barbara, and they indicate that while there is flow, in 2014, our figures showed that there were 32 billion in climate finance in Latin American investments, 24 billion of which is public. Okay, so you can see that that is how much public finance is involved. But of course, the gaps are substantial. You need 176 billion to comply or to be on track with the international commitments. In Brazil, that's a $48 billion gap yearly. In Mexico, it's a $36 billion gap that still exists. So one major problem is scale. How do we scale up? And particularly that becomes a problem if we are talking about public finance, for reasons that I'll mention in just a second. I will let my colleagues talk about that issue, which I think is at the heart of what we're doing here. I'll mention a second challenge that has emerged. That challenge, many of you may know the idea of a Dutch disease. If you discover resources, it creates monetary problems for you. Maybe there's a German disease that we have seen, which is very substantial public support and financing into renewable energy. You build out renewable energy generation at a high speed, but we start to see falling demand for energy. Not just in Germany, but in the US, in China, there is falling demand where we expected higher demand because of growth rates. What we find is these systems do not have adequate flexibility to deal with the variation in renewable energy. And so what needs to be done, and the Germans have moved this way, at first they simply constrained the renewable energy. That is, they didn't put it into the system even when it was available at zero marginal cost. That clearly raises system costs, and the Germans have had to struggle with this. The Chinese are now struggling with it. The Germans have changed their entire policy structure, what they call Energiewende 2, to try and deal with the systemic elements of a differently constituted energy system. The Chinese at this point, if you go to China, you'll find most of the renewable energy on any given day is not running. And the costs of that are left on the developers, which happens to be the state anyway, because the state dominates the energy sector. But my point is, we are coming to an issue which, as the quantity of renewable energy, variable supply energy grows, especially if it is zero marginal cost, like wind and like solar, you have to re-optimize your energy system. Brazil has less far to go than others because you've always designed the system around capacity. And the Brazilian model, strange as it may seem to you, is one that will spread more broadly in the world. But this is a major issue that involves governments changing policy so that the technologies that are developing can actually spread and take hold. The other issues then that have to be dealt with are the problem of scaling up finance, especially if it's public finance, to adequate levels at a time when the macroeconomic situation has seriously deteriorated. I'm not going to go into that now except to say something about the direction we need to turn. Working with Joaquim Levy and other of my colleagues here, Juliano Asuncion at PUCI, governments are starting to understand that the key to sustainability, the key to environment, is to find places where investment, especially infrastructure investment, can both grow the economy at rates that will start to take us out of these macroeconomic problems that are being felt, certainly in my country, in all the OECD countries, where our growth rates are half of what they were traditionally. And that goes back all the way to the 1870s, let alone in Brazil, where the crisis in macroeconomic terms is too obvious to talk about, or in China, where, with proper skepticism for the figures, the growth rates have fallen very sharply, from 11% down to somewhere between 3 to 4%. And the question is really, how are governments going to deal with it? Because under these macroeconomic conditions, what we are essentially seeing are restricted supplies of public finance that are subject to more and more demands for income redistribution, for security, and in fact, the record of putting money into infrastructure is declining. So scaling up is a big problem under macro conditions, changing the organization of the energy systems, and I would say the agriculture systems. Maybe I can talk about that more at the end of the month. This is the last problem. Second problem. What's the last problem? And I'm going to take 2 minutes because this is the subject of today's work, I think. There has been an enormous shift over the past 30 to 40 years in the world of infrastructure and public government. 35 years ago, except for the US, which was still a heavily regulated system, infrastructure was produced in the public sector with public budgets. It is still that way in half the world. Okay, we shouldn't forget that. And the reforms that have taken place under all the pressures of market change and financial change and political change that we have experienced have not done a complete job. In different countries, we find different forms of hybrid public and private activity. The way that the world has responded to this in general is to transfer responsibility within governments. Maybe that's for me. I'm just going to make a point, 1 or 2 more points and quit. What we have seen is a shift away from direct fiscal instruments, including things like investment budgets, to financial regulators and central banks. If you think about the large macro problems, we try to solve them through quantitative easing and a series of other measures. The same thing is happening in the world of sustainability finance. And so you sit here and we talk about disclosure, about consumer protection, about financial stability, and we fund financial regulators and the central banks in a way because the other means of dealing with this problem have not worked out due to fiscal austerity. The problem has fallen into the financial sector. Is that going to work? Is that not going to work? If we had more time, a lot more time for this one, I would ask 3 questions, and I'll stop with those questions. 1, are the arguments that financial markets are misvaluing infrastructure and other long-term assets true or not when we really look at how financial valuation works? 2, if it turns out to be the case that there is substantial misvaluation, and I'm a bit skeptical about that because of the way you actually do financial valuation if we look at it carefully. 2, is the public sector, through the central bank and financial regulators, in better shape to handle that problem than the various other direct ministries and the like who are apparently unable to handle the sustainability or other issues appropriately? That itself is a very difficult question given what central banks and financial regulators do. And so I'll close with simply 2 remarks. 1, in China, which is a very different case, where capital markets are deeply structured and where stock markets are highly imperfect, in the valuation of assets. They have decided to use green finance, administered through the People's Bank of China, as their principal way of dealing with environmental issues. Okay, that will create a big effect. In our parts of the world where this is less true, I think disclosure will matter a great deal, but not necessarily because it will generate more direct regulation, and certainly not through central banks. It will generate political activity, but it will also create reputational effects and different strategies for corporate governance. And I can imagine derivatives we can issue on the way different firms. Imagine the social risk associated with sustainability. It will stir things up, and it is important. But in the end, infrastructure is a public sector and will become more so as technology works its effects. And so with that, I will simply say thank you for the tolerance for the bit extra time. And that's my sense. I'm happy to develop more of it in private or in my talks in Bandas later in this month. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for the challenging speech. Now we pass to Barbara. Yes.
Obrigada. Bom dias. I'm not going to speak in Portuguese. I'm very sorry. I promise every time I'm here, I promise that I will improve my Portuguese. I will work on that, but not for a speech instead. Anyway, thank you very much for having me here. Thank you very much to the organizers. It's a true privilege to be here and share what we are doing at CPI in the context of innovative finance, and also specifically here in Brazil, where we do have a team that works in the office of my colleague Juliana Assunção, who is leading very important work here and is here with us today. So I'm excited to share that work and hopefully start a very good collaboration with your lab. Again, I think I'm going to share some experience from a lab that we have initiated a few years ago. And I really see that there's a lot of common interests and synergies in the group that you're launching here. And I'm trying to be as loud as I can to make this clear. Okay. So before actually going into where I see labs can really make a difference in addressing one of the issues that Tom has mentioned, which is scaling up investments that are both good for the economy but also for the environment. I do want to give you a little context and some facts and figures that hopefully will make it also on your website that really show you where we stand today. So what you can see, I think the good news is that after leveling off in 2012 and decreasing in 2013, most recent figures that we have globally show that more money than ever is being invested in climate change. And that is because of this constant increase in public resources, but also because of record levels in private investments. This 392 billion global investments is really kind of drawn on a wide range of different sources. It's both domestic and international sources, and it should give you an understanding of really where we stand compared to the climate goals that we are facing today. And while it looks like quite a lot of money, if you actually put it in context of where we need to go, it is actually very little. So we can see here, if you look just at the estimates of the International Energy Agency of where we need to go if we want to get on a low-carbon climate resilient pathway, we need about 30.5 trillion just to get us to really finance that and disease national plans of countries in the context of the energy sector. But if you really want to go on the 2 degrees pathways, which is what countries have agreed to in the Paris Agreement, we need about a 1.1 trillion a year between now and the next 15 years to really get the energy sector only on a sustainable pathway. So we can see, while a lot is happening, we're falling far short of what really is needed. And so in order to really understand, what are the opportunities for transformation, where can innovative finance instruments make a difference, it is good to take stock of what is happening. Again, I commend the launch of the lab here because I see that there's a lot of stock taking that will be happening here in the lab. And I'm going to keep you awake with a very complicated graph for a second, which I don't want you to look into detail. It's just to show you what we at CPI do since 2011 to really understand the landscape of climate finance. finance. So what we do is we provide every year a snapshot of how money is flowing through its life cycle. So really understanding who are the actors, what's the sources, both public and private, both international and domestic, who are the intermediaries, what's the role of development finance institutions, national development banks, what's the role of the private sector, what types of instruments are being used, and where does the money ultimately end up. So both in terms of technologies and in terms of geographies. And this really can help you to take stock of what, who are the actors that are active already, who do we need to bring into this game, what are the instruments that are being used, and do they work or don't they work, and what do we need in order to come up with better solutions, and really where are the areas where currently we are really lacking money, and where we need more money in order to really reach our goals. So again, I do hope that this is something that we can help you in your lab here also to really share lessons of what we do every year. And so what we've learned since 2011 in this context is that there's three main barriers that stand in the way of scaling up investments. And I'm going to use the last one then to really focus on the innovative finance part that is the subject of the day today. But what we've seen is that there's three main barriers in the context of that hold investors basically back from going more into climate action. The first one is around policy gaps. So what we see in our work is that the majority of money that we have identified originates, is spent and raised in the same country where it originates. So it shows you how important it is to have good policy environments, to have good policy support frameworks, and really restore the confidence for investors in the market. The second gap that we see is really knowledge. So what we still see today is that there is still a lack of awareness of many investment opportunities and really not understanding what are the opportunities that are related to climate action and climate investments. At the same time, there's also a lack of really rightly pricing the risks and the vulnerabilities that are related to climate change. So this is still lacking in the daily decision making. So this is something that also holds back investments. But the last gap, which we think is the most important one where we really can act if you're also outside of the government, is the risk. So what we see is that investors still perceive, and they must not be real, but they perceive very high range of risks that are related to green investments. We also see that there is an inadequate access to finance, and there's also uncertainties on the ability of returns that investors will have if they invest in more sustainable technologies. So we see that there is a real need there to redefine or improve or innovate financial instruments that really can address the needs of different types of investors in order to really scale up climate action. And that is what I'm going to focus on in my second part of my talk here, which is our experience with the lab that we established in 2014. It's a global innovation lab for climate finance, so it has really come out of interest from a number of donor governments who wanted to use their public seed funding more effectively to really drive private investment in climate action and scale emerging economies. So the goal is really to come up, to design, to develop, to stress test, and to ultimately pilot new financial solutions that can get climate investments in emerging countries to scale. And so what's the secret behind the lab, and what are some of the ingredients that again I hope can in some way help you to shape your lab as you go forward. I think the first one is again a powerful partnership between public and private investors. You can see here we have brought together a very strong group of both development finance institutions. IDB is one of the founding members there as well, Vendessa as well. We do have a number of commercial banks like Bank of America, Deutsche Bank, institutional investors and Allianz. We also have project developers and different types of finance ministries and other types of really financial institutions that can help to understand better what are the current barriers in the market. The second ingredient is a new approach. So what we do in the lab is that we crowdsource ideas. We have an open international pool for ideas where we try to get the best ideas that people in our universities, in labs, in different types of financial institutions have. And then we ask the lab members to actually vote for the most promising ideas. So it is a competitive process. It really comes up with those ideas, merit some better analysis where we at CPI will help, drawing again on the lab membership, that develop innovative finance solutions. And so just in a nutshell, the impact that we've had in a little over 3 years is that we actually have helped fundraise more than $600 billion for concrete projects, pilot projects in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and in adaptation around the world. We have received endorsement from the G7 in our first year. And given the success of the Global Lab, we have actually replicated the lab model now also in different ways, particularly in different geographies, because as you have understood here very well, is whenever you really try to tackle a problem in a specific market, it is important to draw on the national stakeholders and those who really know the market. So we do have an India lab since 2 years, and since last year we are lucky to also have a Brazil lab. Brazil lab, again, similarly as the Global Lab, draws on a very high membership, very high-level experts from public and private institutions and institutional investors in Brazil here, but also commercial banks and also ministries. Brazil Lab came out and was launched in September 2016 under the auspices of the US-Brazil Working Group on Climate Change. We do have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which actually is on a steering committee, but we do have the Ministry of Finance also as a member, and we have been also in contact with the Ministry of Environment, and I do hope again that today is like the first step to bring the two labs closer together. And again, I think we have been very successful in bringing up some new innovative instruments that are specifically here for the Brazilian market, because the overall goal of the Brazil Lab is really to come up with some new financial solutions that can help Brazil to implement its NDCs, its national development plans. And to finish, let me just give you some concrete examples. We've been talking a lot about where we are, why we need innovation, what is the role of innovation really addressing some of the barriers in the market, and the real importance of having these public-private initiatives such as the lab that you are launching today. But I think it is helpful to give you a few concrete examples that can really show you what are some of these financial instruments that currently address some of the needs and the barriers that investors have today in the market. And so I'm starting with one instrument that is actually came out from the Global Lab, and will then give you a very brief overview over the three instruments that we're currently developing in the Brazil Lab. The first instrument is actually, Maria is here, Maria is one of the brains behind that instrument here, is the energy savings insurance. And this is actually an instrument that aims to overcome the barriers to energy efficiency investments by small and medium enterprises by really coming up with an insurance product that guarantees the expected savings of energy efficiency projects. So we really address the performance risks that investors see are related with energy efficiency, and this instrument actually has shown that it can absorb up to 80% of the performance risks related to energy efficiency. IDB has been leading this instrument here. We have a number of concrete projects already in Mexico and in Colombia. Currently, IDB is replicating the instrument in a total of 7 Latin American countries, including Brazil here. And we do have very strong interest also in scaling the model in Asia. And I think the other real success of this instrument is that we have managed to get funding approval from the Green Climate Fund for one of the pilots in El Salvador. And again, the goal of the lab, of our lab, is really to come up with the first pilot, come up with a kind of a bankable project that can be replicated and scaled up around the world. And so coming up with something that then is like receives funding from other institutions is really exactly what we want, because we are a small incubator, we want to collaborate with others, we want to make sure that we then really scale up. The second instrument is something I think we've heard today also a lot from some of the previous speakers, the need to use instruments that are already where investors are familiar with, but which have not really been applied in the context of green investments. And the Green Receivables Fund is exactly that. This is like coming out from the goal, the need to expand the pool of private investors in the context of green investments. And it builds on an established and regulated instrument here in Brazil, and I'm certainly going to pronounce it not rightly now, but it's the Fundo de Investimento Directos Créditos, FIDIC. And this one has been actually used by companies to raise capital by securitizing receivables from business and consumer loans. And the green fatigue is now applying this one to green projects. We do have a number of current pilots that we are exploring, both in the context of energy efficient street lighting and in the context of a PV project. Again, by actually securitizing, this instrument can help reduce the transaction costs, increase the flexibility, liquidity, and diversification, and in this way it can bring in a broader pool of private investors, most importantly Brazilian institutional investors, which really are able to provide long-term capital at local currency rates. I'm very excited about this one. The second instrument that we're exploring in the Brazil lab is focused on cattle ranching, and you know better than me how important cattle ranching is in the context of deforestation and local greenhouse gases here. And we're really moving from the current cattle ranching practices towards a more sustainable and more intensified approach. You can not only reduce deforestation and greenhouse gases, but you can also increase productivity, profitability of cattle ranchers, and bring new jobs and new technologies and expertise to rural areas. So this instrument here, the Climate Smart Cattle Ranching, is actually providing a new aggregate business model in which the idea is to really provide finance and technical assistance to ranchers that do not have land titles in order to help them improve the sustainability and profitability of cattle ranching practices. TNC, who is the proponent of this instrument here, already has a pilot for 43 farms here in Brazil, but we're currently trying to support the rollout of this instrument to more than 300,000 hectares, which could have a very strong implication, again, on the profitability, on deforestation by non-greenhouse gases. And the final instrument I'm going to talk about, which comes out from our Brazil lab, is the distributed generation for cooperatives. This is distributed generation, which are small on-site grid-connected units, are very important here in Brazil because they really can help Brazil to increase its share of renewable energy in the power supply beyond hydropower. But up to now, they've faced a number of barriers in the context of high upfront costs and not the availability to really provide financing for the full life cycle of projects. So this instrument here really tries to reduce the bureaucracy and increase the flexibility in the market and provide this way a long-term, affordable, pay-per-use renewable energy to agricultural cooperatives. And you can see that this is kind of a big potential to really improve the Brazilian overall pathway for sustainable development. So with that, I'm going to stop here. Again, I'm very proud of this project here. I do see as innovation as the one way to really move from thought to action very quickly. And I really hope that there will be lots of ways to provide lessons from our work, your lab, and that we will be able to collaborate in the future. And there will be our next lab meeting at the end of this month, which I will be inviting everyone who is interested to join us there. Thank you very much.
To the green bonds in Brazil and around the world.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here, especially to see many familiar faces that CBI has been working with over the last 15 to 18 months here in Brazil. A very fortunate position for CBI on this specific agenda. And of course, Tom and Barbara, excellent start to the conversation today, great presentations. Tom with the big global picture on opportunities and challenges on the green agenda, and of course with Barbara's breakdown of the flows of climate finance and moving into the aim of fostering innovative financial products that are going to move that finance to the most needed areas, particularly those great examples we see in Brazil. Of course, I will be speaking very much about one specific product, and one that is not new or innovative. Many of you have been hearing about green bond buzz now for a good couple of years. Some of you know it quite well, and others may sort of know. But what green bonds has been moving a significant amount of capital, and also very much so serving as a catalyst to making not only governments but also private sector thinking more widely about green finance. So it has definitely managed to produce many different co-benefits from just being about financing green projects and assets. And so this is something worth highlighting. But I think for today's session on this part, I'm going to be giving just more the global picture of what has been developing internationally on green bonds. And then later this afternoon, going into the labs, I'll speak very specifically about the role that public sector bodies have been playing in different regions of the world to help foster market development. So of course, here we've got showing you really the phenomenal growth that we have seen in a very short period of time. Now 10 years was one of the first green bonds to come out by World Bank and EIB, has now really seen the growth within a 3 to 5 year period, where 2014 was coined as the year of green bonds. And from a development finance institution-driven market to now multiple different types of issuers, both on the public and private side, 2016 was where we saw other countries like China coming in to participate. And in the 2016 year period, China went from zero issuance to 40% of the issuance total that year. And a lot of that was the role that the public sector played, central bank and other regulatory bodies, in helping to provide the enabling environment to foster growth. And so we expect to see those numbers to grow even more so in this year and into 2018. And of course, this year has already seen roughly about $60 billion US dollars. So it's a structure that investors understand very easily. It is a bond. It is not asking for anything different other than a few three things. One is transparency and disclosure around the use of proceeds and management of those proceeds. Making sure that those proceeds are financing eligible green projects and assets. And eligible green projects and assets is a live debate today with many different organizations around the world tackling what that definition of work is on green. And then of course the reporting component, annual reporting component, that investors understand very clearly what issuers have committed to, they are fulfilling those commitments over the life term of the bond. And this in itself has become extremely attractive to investors. Investors like the fact that they know where their money's going, and at the same time the product is addressing risks in their portfolio, which is the initial driver. Which leads me into sort of going more deeply into the drive that investors have been pushing on this agenda. So I wouldn't necessarily say the investors are climate activists. I definitely wouldn't say they're environmentalists, but they most definitely have identified that climate and other environmental factors are posing risks in their portfolio. And with that, they are now looking for ways in which they can address that risk. And from the beginnings with the Nordic pension funds, Swedish pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, really looking deeply into this has now transpired into high, very well-known investors, Mundi, Morova, Allianz, Zurich, all making very strong statements on buying green bonds, putting in dedicated funds, and in that has created demand. But of course, there's so much demand on the international stage that there's not enough green supply to meet that demand. There's not enough green bonds to meet it. Within a 2-hour window, a green bond is gone. And of course, this is when we saw the benchmark issuance of IFC's €1 billion bond in 2013, which really spun the market out to have quite an incredible year for 2014. And we have continued to see that level of demand and oversubscription in the market. To just give you a snapshot of where we're seeing many of these green bonds, where the financing is going, predominantly on renewable energy, refinancing of wind, solar, we've seen hydropower, geothermal, so across the board within the renewable energy sector. Second to that, we've seen much on the property portfolios on energy efficiency. And then we have seen a growth happen within water, infrastructure, transport in particular, and so on. As we begin to get a better understanding of what we mean in green in complicated areas, I would say that land use is not a straightforward investment area for investors that know nothing about the complexity that comes with that on green. So the work that needs to be done on opening up the understanding, not only just for investors, but also for issuers, on what their portfolio can actually contain to be considered green is work in progress. But we have seen some good examples hit the market. And here you can also see the geographical spread of where we have seen issuance. One thing that CBI is beginning to look very closely into, we also hold on to the largest green bond data in the world to date with our partnership with Bloomberg. And so every year we're putting out market reports, and in between that, looking very specifically at certain trends in the market. And there's been a lot of discussion, and it's always the first thing the Treasury tends to ask when we speak with them about the opportunity of green bonds. Well, this is all nice, and financing green is all great, but we would actually like to know if there's any kind of price advantage here. It's usually a very typical CFO question. And well, what we have seen recently is that we are beginning to see that. Issuers have been making quite strong claims, but we did a deep dive into the analysis and came to find that on average we are now beginning on the international market at USD and euro-denominated bonds at about 200 billion or more is at 20 basis point advantage, so on average. It is still preliminary work, but it is one that we will be posting in September, and we're beginning to continue to work on expand that analysis. But at least on the international stage, this is something we're beginning to see, which is quite encouraging. For the investor appetite, and this has been highlighted by both Barbara and Tom, one of the biggest challenges is scale. So at least internationally, bonds 250 million or more is really the minimum at which you're getting institutional investors to react. So in many cases, that's very difficult. Bankable projects, pipelines, in particularly emerging markets, in some of the countries that I've been working in, for instance, Nigeria and Kenya, and working close to the public sector, it's very difficult to be able to put together portfolios that are ready for investors to invest in. And this is a challenge across the world. Scale is an issue. But this is about big bonds that are needed, small bonds more on a private placement, comparable pricing, and if you can see an issue in USD or Euro, then the yield factor is something that is quite attractive to investors currently, given the current conditions that are happening in the European market. Local currency, on the other hand, tends to be more reliant on the credit. And breaking it down more specifically to Brazil, so last year we had put out a State of the Market report, a special edition for Brazil, just to get a sense of really where is the opportunity that we have here. There's no doubt that Brazil has the opportunity to be a leader on green finance globally. And it's easy to say that, of course, because the steps to get to that is really understanding the starting point and beginning to put in the appropriate measures and enabling conditions to foster a strong capital market, which is currently lacking. However, the green investment landscape that this country sits on cannot be underestimated. It is more so than any other country in the world. Where we see China putting green finance at the top of their agenda, prioritizing green finance as a fundamental strategy to meeting its 5-year plan, that drive has mainly been because of the environmental liability that they are faced with, and then in that itself becomes a national security issue. They've put that as a forefront. But if you look at a country like Brazil, Brazil has the opportunity to provide sustainable
agri-products at scale offshore sustainably. They can show the world exactly how this gets done and be able to incentivize that with green finance. And where you can begin to look at the developments that are happening in China, where investors will, in time, be looking offshore to invest in green. Is it Brazil that will be able to give them that opportunity? And so it becomes ever so more important for Brazil to understand that it has a new economic narrative to take advantage. That in the dark times, you walk away and you look for the opportunity. And Brazil's is literally branding this country as the leader on green. Because as Tom has highlighted, since Rio 92, this has been an agenda that has really been the focus of discussion and development in the Brazil society, and something that, traveling all over the world, what I have found is that nobody knows sustainability or climate change better than the Brazilians. Whether they act on it is a different story, and that's for every country around the world, to be fair. So just almost wrapping up, not too much longer, a couple minutes. This is just to give you a sense of really where the strengths lie on Brazil's economy, and agri is no doubt one of the largest. And so how can we begin to support the growth of sustainable agriculture production in Brazil and brand that offshore through green bond financing and other measures like green CRAs, for example, which is something that we are currently looking at. Energy, going beyond hydropower. Yes, 75% of the grid is hydropower sourced. We've got a very successful wind example out of Brazil, but what about solar? Solar is the next opportunity that we need to be working on getting into the system. And then to conclude, this year we have seen a emergence of green sovereign bonds. We expect to see more. Poland and France, the first one, yes, shocked the world. We weren't expecting that. It's debatable on whether how green that really was. But at the end of the day, what it's showing is that governments are waking up to the opportunity of figuring out how to tap that 100 trillion of assets under management of private capital, which is the only way that any country is going to really truly address their climate challenges. There's not enough public resources to do this. And so figuring out how to tap that effectively is going to be key. But it does come down to developing robust, incredible green project pipelines. And the work of the labs is fundamental in getting that to happen. And so these previous steps before even getting to bond financing is essential if we're going to be able to succeed. And then third, which is a lot of what the IDB lab with CEM and others is trying to address, is what is the role of public sector bodies like central banks and other regulators? What do we need for us to be able to really reach the scale that is required? So with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justine. Nós não vamos abrir imediatamente para o público, porque a próxima sessão é justamente para uma sessão para debater as apresentações. Então, já foi acertado aqui pelo tempo já decorrido, a gente passa imediatamente à próxima sessão e no final da sessão seguinte a gente abre para a plateia se manifestar, uma vez que aqui já vai ser debatida as duas apresentações. Ok? Então, eu queria agradecer enormemente a presença dos palestrantes, em nome da BDE, do BID e da CBM, e agradecer, passamos imediatamente, encerramos essa mesa, passamos imediatamente a mesa seguinte.